welcome again to another episode of Digging Deeper. I am so glad to be with you, and I hope that you are doing well this week. If you're joining us for the first time in Digging Deeper, just to explain what this is it's an opportunity for you to take part in a small group Bible study, really, with me as your facilitator. What I'll do during this time is I'll provide some opportunities for you to pause the video and to discuss these questions among yourselves. Hopefully you're doing this with some other people. I realize some folks are doing this on their own, and that's great as well. But hopefully, and the design of this is that you would do this with other folks and be able to discuss these questions in the context of community. So I hope you have an opportunity to do that. And again, good to be with you. Also, just a couple things to mention. First of all, you feel free to mix and match. If some of these questions are not, you don't feel irrelevant or not something that you really want to dwell on, don't feel any kind of tension over just skipping by those questions, moving on to something that would be more apropos, or dwelling on one. Sometimes, I know in groups I've been in, sometimes the group will just hang out on one question and really deal with that in a deep way, and I think that's wonderful. You know, if there's something that is a real issue of need in your group, I think it's wonderful to be able to spend that time discussing that issue. And so I encourage you just to use these questions however you see fit, however is most useful to you. And again, if you'd like these questions in advance for your group members, I would welcome you to reach out to me and ask for those, toldham@discoverlifepoint.com. I'd be glad to send those to you in advance of your group so you could distribute and disseminate those to your group, and they would be able to be thinking about those before your group happens and before you watch this video. So that is my little spiel here at the beginning, and let's get underway as we finish the series on the text that is commonly called the Lord's Prayer. It's really the model prayer. So 3 questions here at the outset. These are questions that I ask at the beginning every time, and that might seem a little bit redundant. Let me just explain why we do that. The reason for these first 3 questions is if there's somebody who maybe feels a little bit out of place in a group like this because they don't have a whole lot of background in Bible. Well, these first 3 really just deal with opinions, and they deal with the perception of folks about the message. And so there's no prior experience or knowledge required for these. It's simply asking how the message affected the people who heard it, how you were impacted by it. That's what these first questions are about. So the first question is this: what did you like in the message? What did you like in the message? What did you think was a really good point or a really good portion of the message? Let me give you a moment to discuss that as a group. What did you like in the message? Okay, second question: what did you disagree with in the message? What did you disagree with in the message? Was there something that was not clear that you thought, my goodness, I don't know if that's right or not? And I hope you can summon the courage to discuss that as a group, or to raise that in your group there and talk about one of those things, or maybe a couple of the things that you disagreed with in the message. So let me give you a moment to discuss that. All right, third question: what do you remember the most from the message? What do you remember the most from the message? Was there something that was particularly memorable, something that really stuck out to you, something that was just very significant in your life? If there was, please share that at this moment. I'd love to have you share that with your group, and maybe it was the big idea, maybe it was the one of the main points, or maybe it was just something that was mention in passing. Either way, share what you remember the most from the message. Let me give you a moment to do that. All right, well, this is obviously the last part of the model prayer, and it is about temptation. Lead us not into temptation is how the text reads. So let's start off with this question. What is temptation? What is temptation? Love to have you come up with some thoughts on that as a group. Let me give you a moment to discuss that. What is temptation? Okay, as I do for many of these, I didn't, and this is just the way I'm wired, instead of going to an English dictionary, Merriam-Webster or something, and trying to find out how it is defined, how a word is defined in English, what I like to do, and hopefully this is helpful, is I like to go back to the original languages and look in a lexicon of the original languages and see how this word is translated or how it is defined in one of those lexicons, which is basically a dictionary of another language. And so when I looked up the word temptation, which I believe is parasmos is the word, it is to entice to improper behavior. To entice to improper behavior. That is the specific meaning in this context, is to entice to improper behavior. Now, just want to give you a little full disclosure. This may be more than you are wanting to know, but interestingly, the word translated temptation, which is parasmos, depending on the context, can just mean a time of testing. It can be a time of trying, of trial, or of adversity in different places in Scripture, depending on the context. But in other places, it is, as it is here, an enticement. Talking temptation as an enticement to improper behavior, or to entice to improper behavior would be to tempt. And so in this passage, what Jesus is saying to his disciples, he is saying, you should ask, and by extension, we should ask, that we not be led into temptation. Now, I want to point one thing out here that I think is significant along with this, and that's the fact that in a sense, we can call this the Lord's Prayer because it was the Lord who gave this prayer, and maybe that's the sense we think about it. But it's not the prayer that the Lord would pray. And I say that because he had prayed, forgive us our debts, and that's something that he would never have prayed. However, temptation is something that he did face, and we're going to talk about that a little bit here in a couple of questions. So I'm going to hold off on that because the text we'll be looking at today is going to address some of those issues and actually raise some questions. So temptation is to entice to improper behavior. Second question, is temptation something that happens suddenly or slowly? Why or why not? Actually, that's a lousy question. Is temptation something that happens suddenly or slowly? So really, it's not why or why not, because it's not a yes or no question. Would you say it happens suddenly or slowly is really the question. And the question is why? Why do you answer the way you do? Let me give you a moment to discuss that. Is temptation something that happens suddenly or slowly? Why do you answer the way you do? Okay, well, hopefully you had some good thoughts on that. Usually temptation usually involves, as I have encountered in my own life and as I have seen it described in other people's lives, usually it requires a degree of premeditation. That is, temptation involves forethought, that it's something that starts in the mind. It starts that we think about this, doing something, or we start thinking about, oh, that'd be nice if I, and wouldn't it be easier if I, and I think life would be better if I. And so I think sometimes that's how it starts, is it starts in the mind. It involves thought. And I think that's important because temptation is usually a pathway, right? That it starts off over here, but before we know it, we're over here. As we capitulate or give in to temptation, the temptation continues to evolve, and really we go farther down into it. I had a professor, Howard Hendricks, that one time said to our class that spiritual failure in the Christian life is almost never a blowout. It's usually a slow leak. And I think that is absolutely accurate, that usually we don't just all of a sudden get ambushed by temptation and the wheels come off and everything just blows up. Usually it is a process of us giving in a little more, giving in a little more, and eventually we find ourselves way, way, way from where we ought to be. And so, and we're going to see this in the text today, but usually it starts in the mind. Temptation starts in the mind. I mean, it may be spurred on by something we think about, something somebody says, an idea we get from media or wherever, but then it enters our mind and we begin to think about it, and then that temptation begins to take root. And that's usually how the process goes. So I would say that typically temptation is something that happens slowly. Now, we can get hit with something, that initial thing that somebody says, the initial idea we have. The question is, what do we do with that from there? I'll at this point, I have this in my notes, but I will say what Martin Luther said about temptation. He said, it's not possible to keep the birds from flying over your head, but you can keep them from making a nest in your hair. I think that's a really good thought there, and that's exactly how it is with temptation. We can't keep from being exposed to ideas that are sinful, ideas that are improper, would involve improper behavior. But what we can do is choose not to meditate and not to fix our minds on those things. Instead, to just evict those as soon as they come and not just continue to consider this and ruminate on it, because if we do that, that will take us down the wrong path, absolutely, certainly. Okay, well, let me, and I'll say this before we get going. There was a lady who was in her 80s back when I was in Colorado, and when I was there, she asked me. She never asked me a question before, and she said to me, "Why did Jesus say, 'Lead me not in temptation,' if God doesn't try to get us to sin?" And that was a great question. I was left flat-footed. But you really, and I think Matt mentioned this, that this involves a figure of speech called litotes. It is a figure of speech that is a form of understatement. And so that's exactly what is being used here. When Jesus says, "Lead us not in temptation," it is an emphatic request that God deliver us, protect us, that He keeps us safe from temptation. God would not lead us there. It is a form of understatement. And it comes by expressing the contrary, to express something by negating the contrary, rather. And there's you could come up with different examples for this, but let me give you an example. Say, well, there were not a few people went to that game. Not a few people went to that ball game. Well, when I'm saying not a few people went, what I mean is there was a whole bunch of people that went. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing here. He said, when he says, "Lead us not in temptation," is an emphatic request that God, you will deliver me from temptation, protect me from temptation. It's not the idea that God actually would try to lead us into temptation. So, enough said about that. Let's get into the passage for today. James chapter 1, 13 through 15. I think Matt actually referenced this one, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper in it and just think a little bit more about it with you. And so so read James 1, 13 through 15. I wanted to give you a moment to do that. Maybe use some different versions. That's just 3 verses, I believe, so it shouldn't take you very long. Several of you can share from different versions. But why is it important to understand where temptation comes from? Why is it important to understand where temptation comes from? So let me give you a moment to read that and then discuss that question. Why is it important to understand where temptation comes from? Go ahead and discuss. Okay, I don't know what you came up with, but let me go ahead and read to you from James 1, verses 13 through 15. Again, this video doesn't have the text on here, and so you'll need to be either read this or have this text in front of you. Hopefully you'll have it on your phone or in print. But it says in verse 13, "Let no one say when he is tempted, 'I am being tempted by God.' For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. There's a lot there. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. So that is the anatomy of a sin, or an autopsy of a sin, if you want to say it that way. So why is it important to understand where temptation comes from? Well, it's important because if we're tempted to think that God is the originator of temptation, there are a number of, I would say, theological problems with that. First of all, it impugns the character of God, because if God is opposed to sin, if he wants nothing to do with sin, then him encouraging us or trying to get us to sin would be really a violation or an impugning of his character, because that would not be what he'd do. And it would also violate his character in the sense that he is pure, he is holy, he does not try to solicit people to do evil. He does not encourage us or try to entice us into evil doing. Also, this verse says, so it's important to understand that God is not out there trying to get people to sin. I think that would be a gross misunderstanding of temptation to think that. But also, you notice it also says God cannot be tempted by evil. And I think that's a challenging question, because we know Jesus was tempted, right? And we see that in the Gospels. How could he be tempted if he was God in the flesh? And if he was tempted, then either he wasn't tempted or this verse is wrong, it would seem. Well, let me tell you how I think the best way, what the best way I think to resolve that is. And that is this, that temptations for us come from a couple of different sources, right? There is an internal temptation, and this is maybe a little bit simplistic, but there's this internal temptation with which we're very familiar. We might say it's a temptation from the flesh, where and that is the fallen tendency of us to gravitate towards sin. And so oftentimes you will know your heart gravitates or wants to sin. That there is a desire there that's battling in your heart that wants to sin. That is something that is just a condition of fallen humanity. It's a reality because of what happened in Genesis chapter 3. And ever since then, we have had this inborn or this fundamental desire to sin. So there's that, but then there's also external, what I would call external temptation, which would be from the world or from Satan and his influences. And so when you break it up like that into internal and external, I think it's important to look at how Jesus was tempted. Jesus was holy. He was perfect. In fact, he was sinless. He was not infected with sin. He was not infected with the curse of sin. He took that upon himself on the cross, but he was not fallen. And so, having said that, he didn't have that thing we call the flesh. Now, he had a physical body, but he didn't have the thing that is referred to as the flesh, which is that inclination and that tendency and that prerogative, or that tendency to sin. And he was not just predisposed that direction. Jesus didn't have that internal temptation, but he did have Satan and the world as we see the temptation unfold. And so when it says God cannot be tempted by evil, the way I understand that is here in James is that God cannot have that inner compulsion to sin as we do. He does not have a predisposition towards sin like we do. And so while Jesus was tempted by the world and by the devil, he was not tempted from the inside, from his flesh, from the internal temptation. Second question here, how does this verse help us to understand the importance of paying attention to what we are thinking about. Let me say it again. How does this verse help us to understand the importance of paying attention to what we are thinking about? Let me pause for a moment while you discuss that. Okay, I don't know what you came up with there as far as the importance of paying attention to what we're thinking about, but it is really, really important what you think about. We live from our hearts, or another way of saying that is we live from our thoughts. And so how important it is, how critical it is that we are very careful about what occupies our minds and what we attend to mentally. There is a passage here in Proverbs, and I think it's such a significant passage. It's Proverbs 4:25, I believe. And let me just, so I don't misquote it to you, let me share that with you. There, Proverbs 4:25. I think I wrote down the wrong verse. I've got a knack for that. It's actually verse 23. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life." I've heard this verse literally rendered, guard your heart, for from it flow the springs of life. What the writer there, Solomon, is saying as he quotes the Israelite wise men and wise women, he is saying that you got to be very careful about what's in your heart and what you dwell on, because what you dwell on comes out in our lives. And so that is where we live from. We live from our hearts. We live from our thoughts. What we think about, what we focus on, what we meditate on comes out in our lives. I hope this is the correct attribution, but Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny." We have to really be careful what we think about, because what we think about takes us down a particular path. And if that's the wrong path, we go farther and farther away from God and to the devastation that brings when we get far from God. And so all that to say, it is very important to attend to and pay attention to what we think about. Very important. Okay, number 3. Does sin always begin with a thought? Why or why not? Does sin always begin with a thought? Why or why not? Or I should say, why do you answer the way you do? I don't know. These questions seem wonky to me today. Does sin always begin with a thought? Why do you answer the way you do? Let me take a moment to give you an opportunity to discuss that. Does sin always begin with a thought? All right. Well, I hope you had some thoughts there. I think I mentioned that we live from our thoughts. We live from our thoughts, from our hearts. Let me give you another proverb here at this point. Proverbs 27, verse 19. Should have kept my finger in Proverbs here. Proverbs 27, 19. This is what we read here. And it's just it's a brief verse. It's just tucked into the interior of the book of Proverbs, but it's so good. "As in water, face reflects face, so the heart of man reflects the man. As in water, face reflects face, so the heart of man reflects the man." Look at that. He's saying that you look in water and you see reflection in water. Well, in the same way, the heart of man reflects the man. In other words, what is in our heart, what we look like in our hearts, is what comes out in our behavior. It's the way that we live out our lives. Jesus said this. Remember when Jesus said, from the heart come, all these sins, sexual immorality, greed. He made a list of different sins that emerge as a result of the human heart. And so it's just very important what we think about. Again, does sin always begin with a thought? Well, I would say yes, it does. It depends what we do when we're confronted with an opportunity or an inclination, what we do with that. And so what do we do with that? That's the question. You remember that song you might have learned many years ago, be careful little eyes what you see, be careful little, I'm not going to sing for you. But one of the stanzas of that should have been, be careful little minds what you think, because what you think is going to determine the direction you go, the direction your behavior leads. Number 4, can it be helpful to remember the result of sinful desire? How? Can it be helpful to remember the result of sinful desire? How? Let me pause while you discuss that. Can it be helpful to remember the result of sinful desire? Well, I think absolutely it can. And that's what James does here, right? He spells this out for us. He says that we're lured and enticed by desire. When it's conceived, it gives birth to sin. Sin brings forth death. Now, that doesn't mean if you sin that you're going to physically die the next day or something like that. Death is a much broader conception. Death is anything that in the Hebrew mind was anything that is a threat to our vitality in our life. So anything that damages us, that damages our life, whether it's spiritual or physical, is the beginning of death, or it's an expression of death. And that's exactly what James is saying here. Is it starts off that we just think about something, we give into the desire, and then that gives birth to sin, and the sin leads to death. The wages of sin is death. And so it is so critical that we remember the outcome. Because when we first confronted with a thought or the idea of sin, it's really good to take that to the logical conclusion. And we oftentimes don't even think about the immediate consequences, much less the far consequences. But every decision is a pathway, and we have to consider, where is that pathway taking us, and where will this thought take us? And so I encourage you to remember the result of sinful desire. I think we all need to do that. It's kind of like a warning on a pill bottle. You know, you ever seen a bottle of pretty much any medication? You look at it and there is a warning on there about what can happen if you overdose, these sorts of things. If you take some other medication, it's just like that. It's a warning on a bottle that this can cause death. This decision, this choice, these thoughts can lead to death. And so it's good for us to read that fine print on the back of the pill bottle before we launch into following after a thought that is going to take us in the wrong direction. Very important. Number 5, last question. What changes do you need to make with regard to temptation in your life? What changes do you need to make with regard to temptation in your life? Let me pause for a moment while you discuss that. What changes do you need to make with regard to temptation in your life? All right, I don't know what you came up with. Obviously, it's a very personal question, and we will probably, if you're in a group, some of you will share to a greater or lesser degree about this. But I would just say that there are different changes that probably every one of us could employ that would help us in this way. The first one is just to avoid temptation. I mean, it's just important that if there are certain places and people who are a source of temptation for us, we need to avoid those places and those people. They're dangerous, because if that's a weak spot, if that's a danger zone for us, we're playing with fire to be in those locations and those with those people. I wrote down here something that Jesus said when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane with his disciples. Remember, he said, watch and pray so you'll not fall into temptation. Watch and pray. I think those are great directives for us to take to heart when we're trying to avoid temptation. We want to be aware of what's going on, to watch our situation, and to be attuned to the dangers in it, but also to pray. Just as Jesus instructed, that we be protected, but we be delivered from temptation and not succumb to it. One way that I've heard this put here at Lifepoint especially is that we need to be careful to find good playgrounds and good playmates, or sometimes you might say it this way, we need to find different playgrounds and different playmates, because there are those, again, places and those people in our lives who really just take us in the wrong direction. They are sources of temptation, and if there are places and people in our lives, a great decision to make is that I am not going to go around those places. Yeah, I remember back, and I don't have the text in front of me, I think it may have been Proverbs chapter 5. We keep referring to Proverbs, don't we? There's a lot of link between Proverbs and James. In fact, I think James has been called the Proverbs in the New Testament. But back in Proverbs, it says of the issue of sexual immorality, that the Israelite youth is instructed not to go near the door of her house. You don't want to pass by that place. You don't want to go to that location where you know temptation waits for you. We need to avoid those places and those people. I hope this has been helpful. I hope that you've maybe gleaned some good thoughts about temptation, but I hope more than that this is a challenge to us to be careful what we think about and to make those decisions in our lives that will protect us from those things that really bring us to the point of death. Not necessarily physical death, but the destruction of our spiritual lives. Let me close this with a word of prayer, and we will see you next time. Father, thank you again for this opportunity to be with these folks, even virtually, and I thank you that you love us, that you are our Father, and I thank you for your word. Father, please deliver us from temptation. Keep us from evil. Keep us from every evil path. We pray that we would choose to think about the right things so that we would do the right things. Keep us from sin. Guide us in your ways. And thank you for your love. In the Savior's name we ask it. Amen. All right, good deal, everybody. I hope you're doing well, and have a great week, and we'll see you next time.